Greetings and welcome to today's hour-long painting lesson. Before we begin here, I'd like to quickly note that we are working on a 7x9 canvas board right here. It is drawn on with a black Sharpie, and I used that for this because it's a canvas board and it won't show through the back. But what it will do is show through the first couple layers of paint. So if we're working kind of roughly in the background and we cover portions of our foreground, we'll still be able to see through and continue to be able to work on that area without having to redraw it. Now, if you're working on a regular canvas, then the Sharpie can show through and bleed through the back, so I'd be careful of that. But if you're working on a canvas board, it is a great medium to work with as well. Now from there, I have my water right here to clean our brushes and thin our paint. I have our cloth to clean everything down. Here I have a glass picture frame as my palette. It has gray underneath because it's a neutral tone and it'll give us a very accurate look at all of our pigments. Here I have some titanium white, primary red, French ultramarine blue. I'm using this instead of a primary blue because it's a little bit warmer and it mixes really well with red. I'm also using a Mars black, and a little bit later in the lesson we will also be using a primary yellow and a burnt umber. With that said, in terms of brushes, I'm using a large square-headed brush, a medium-sized square-headed brush, a smaller square-headed brush. Then I also have an old square-headed brush. This is the one where we kind of just pull apart and make sure that it's full of inconsistencies. So you can make a dabbing motion with it and render just a litany of different implications on the canvas. Then I have two round-headed brushes. This one is small, this one's medium-sized. These are fantastic for rendering things with more of a softer aesthetic, blowing snow or mist, things akin to that, because they do have the naturally feathered edges. So that is essentially what we are working with here today, and we're going to begin with the larger square-headed brush. I'm going to dip it in water. Only the tip of it though. I don't want to get this top part because if I do that it can kind of hinder the binding of the brush itself. So I get the top part a little bit wet, I dry it off to the point where it is simply damp, then I'm going to want to begin working on the background. So I'm going to take some titanium white paint, just like that. I'm going to move that over our horizon and slowly blend upwards. This is going to give us a nice little base. I'm going to do the same thing with my brush, make sure that it's damp, not wet. Get some additional pigment. Work my way from the bottom of the horizon upwards. This is going to thicken all of the pigments that we use because primary red and French ultramarine blue are innately a little bit more transparent, and this will act as a thickening pigment. So now I'll get some of that primary red. I'll move it down here on my palette. We'll take the cleaner side of the brush, grab some titanium white. We'll mix the two together, rendering a nice pink color. Then I'm going to take that, I'm going to move it up into the sky here. Now it's mixing with the white that we previously applied, so it's going to look a little bit brighter than it is here on the palette, but that isn't a bad thing. Now I'm going to do a little bit more of that. We'll move it over here. Now it's blending with the pigment we just applied to the canvas because they were both applied with a fairly damp brush, which extends the wet life of the paint. I'm going back and I'm doing this a number of times here. I'm not trying to drag the paint entirely. I'm letting it naturally flow. If I run out of paint on my brush, I'm saying, all right, that's just fine. We will get some more paint. But if you just continue to scrape it, you'll get more of a transparent and toothy aesthetic. You'll see through the canvas. And that's really not what you want. So we do it lightly like that. Here I'm going to grab a little bit more red. I'm going to throw that in here at the bottom to saturate it a little bit more. Because when we add that white, we desaturate it to a point, right? So this is just going to throw that back in there. And you can see that I'm working over my mountain, and I'm not worrying about it. Because, of course, we drew the initial sketch with the Sharpie, and I know exactly where everything is, because I can still see the outlines. However, if you didn't do that, you can just go back and look at the reference photo, the digital sketch that I offer as well, and that should be just as useful. Now I'm going to get some French ultramarine blue right there. I'm going to get a good amount of white, mix the two right here. It's a nice color. I'm going to begin applying this to the top of the painting. Now, at this point, the pink is probably really starting to dry. And as you can see, we're getting a bit of a chalky aesthetic. It's getting a little bit grainy. You get to see the tooth of the canvas. So I'm going to make sure the brush is damp. I'm just going to use that to blend everything together very softly. Just like that. And now we can blend wet layers into dry layers. We'll go back and we'll grab some more of that blue. Apply it to the top. Just like that. We can go back over this area too because it all did blend and we lost the natural blue. So it's just a process of going back and forth. Now we need the brush to be fairly wet again to blend this wet layer into this dry layer. Working in little X patterns, and then horizontally to smooth it out. There we are. Now we're getting a beautiful gradient. Just like that. So, from there, let's dip our brush. Let's get a little bit of a darker blue this time. We'll mix that in with what we had. As you can see, it's a little bit more saturated this time. We'll move that over the top. As we run out, you can see that it's starting to blend much more with the initial pigment. So we'll try some more of this. There we are. Make the brush nice and damp again. And now we can blend. If you find you're getting a streaky motion pattern with your brush, with your paint, fear not, that's only occurring because you're pressing very hard with the brush. You can go back over it as I am here very softly, and it should alleviate that. There we are. Might take a couple of layers and applications, but you will get what you want. It's also worth noting that you don't always have to move your sky across horizontally. Here you can see that I'm using this pattern instead, and it's just giving the sky a little bit more of a direction, a little bit more of a movement, and I really like that. So I like my sky for now. We're going to be doing a lot of trees and falling snow, and it'll look a lot more interesting then. But right now we're just building the base and the foundation. So we'll leave that, and then we'll grab a little bit of Mars Black, just a tiny, tiny bit on the brush, because it's a very strong pigment. Then I'm going to grab some titanium white, mix the two together, get a nice gray. It's fairly light gray. You can see it in comparison to that. And I'm going to start working in my mountain. Initially just with this tone. We'll definitely be adding a lot of additional color to it, but we need, again, a base. With acrylic painting, it's so important, so important, to recognize that it's a process, and it's a process of layering and taking time. That the first time you apply things, they probably won't look fantastic. And they're not meant to. It's meant to be something that builds. So don't get discouraged if your first couple of layers don't look perfect and your painting doesn't look fantastic yet, because generally it's not supposed to. It takes time. It's meant to be relaxing and cathartic, so don't worry about it. There we are. You can see I'm continuously going back, getting more paint, re-implementing it. We're using the larger square-headed brush here because it can cover a lot of surface area, it can hold a lot of paint, and it has a very sharp edge, which is fantastic for rendering sharp edges here on the canvas, right? Especially on things like mountains, harder substances, subjects. There we are. I'm also allowing the grays to be a little bit inconsistent as well, just because the mountain's going to have highlights and darker areas as well. Doesn't need to be perfect. It's also a mountain, so it can be a little bit more grainy, if you want it to be, than the sky. There we are. Just going back, recovering a couple areas. Acrylic paints, when wet, are fairly transparent generally. So when you're working a color on top of another color, it's generally best to do a couple of layers so that you get the natural color showing through. Here I'm just fixing up some of the edges and taking care of the more grainy spots. And to get rid of the streaks, I'm just moving the brush very softly across the canvas. There we are. Now I'm cleaning my brush thoroughly. Just like so. I'm going to put this one down. I'm going to grab the medium-sized square-headed brush instead. I'm going to make sure it's damp, just like the last time. I'm going to grab some of that pink that we still have on our canvas. Then, I'm going to apply that to our newly applied mountain. Predominantly on the sides and edges that are closer to the pink light. Then I'm going to blend it down and back. Sometimes I'll leave a hard edge to imply that the mountain has a hard edge in it and that the light can't wrap around that area. It'll give it a little bit of extra depth. We can go back and add additional highlights, and if we have too much paint, we can wipe it off over there as well. So here, we'll create a little ridge. That side of the mountain's receiving a lot of light. There we are. It's looking great. We'll go back in with a real white highlight as well. But when you want to render depth, you want to generally create darker tones, mid-tones, and light tones. And you build them on top of each other so it looks like light's wrapping around the subject. And that's what we're doing right now. We started with our darker tone, which was the mountain, and now we're building on the middle tones, and soon we'll add on the light tones as well. This mountain is very far away. We'll make it very pink. Subjects in the far, far distance generally adopt much more of the coloring of the sky and atmosphere rather than their innate coloring. So as things progress through the painting and come closer to us in the foreground, you go from something that's very much determined by the background color, so the pinks and the blues, and then it gets more into the grays and the natural colors that you'll see. And that will really be notable when we begin working on the trees as well. So that's looking good. But I want to also incorporate some blues because there are blues in the sky and we have the pink areas, the light is hitting that, but there are also cooler sides to the mountain. So we'll take a little bit of the darker blue here. Make sure it's nice and wet. Just like that. We might even throw in a little bit of black. Make it nice and dark. Then we can begin working in the other areas. And as you can see, that's very dark. Might be a little bit too dark, but we can play around with it. As we blend it in, as you can see, it definitely dissipates as it blends with the natural colors. That's also a really important lesson. Whatever you mix on the palette isn't necessarily what you'll see on the canvas itself, because it's always going to be transparent to a point, and you're always going to see the undercolors in that as well. So right now we're just kind of adding some cool colors to it. It's looking quite nice. Now it's very cohesive with the sky. Here I'm creating some additional little ridges. There isn't really a method to the madness here. I'm just picking areas that I think should be little ways up the mountain, and kind of nice little paths, little indents, things like that. See? It's quite nice. Mountains are off to a great start. Now we can add in some highlights, and for that I'm going to grab a slightly smaller brush. Started with the big one for all of the blocking in, then we did a little bit more intricate work with the medium size, and now we'll do the detail work with this one. So we'll grab some titanium white, make sure that it's nice and wet. We'll go to the top of the mountain, make it a snow-covered mountain. Begin to move the snow right down the mountain. It'll blend with the pinks that we have and the other colors as well, just like that. Doing a bit of a tapping effect to get some areas that are thicker than others. And we're using the smaller square-headed brush because it has a very sharp, fine edge, which is great for rendering detail work, of course. But it can also still hold a good amount of paint. I also like it because you can use the flat edge of it to get a good coverage, but you can also use the tip to get something very sharp and fine, almost like a liner brush, but it can hold more paint than a liner brush. So I find that it has so many advantages to it. So here, we'll create some more snow. I'm doing a dabbing effect. That way I don't blend all of the paint and it kind of comes out a little bit splotchy sometimes. That's an intended aesthetic. And I'm leaving openings, as you can see. And that's also really going to help, because it's going to make it look more dynamic. Just like that. What a beautiful little painting. I love working with pinks and blues. Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to move you guys. We are currently at home for Christmas, the parents' house, so we don't have the regular studio or setup. We're kind of just doing things a little more DIY. But I think it's all turning out quite nice. Always great to be home for the holidays with the family. So, now we'll take some more of that white and come back up here. We were having slight issues with it earlier, only because the paint was still very wet, and it wasn't really ready. It was blending too much. So, now we can come back and retry that. Remember, we're just creating different pathways, like so. And they can go on the other side of the mountain as well. But if you want them to be cool, like that side of the mountain, you can take a little bit of blue and mix that in. Also worth noting, I had two sections of white, and that's because I knew that quickly one of them would become very diluted with other pigments, and I wanted to ensure that I still had the clean white, should I need it. So here, now we're doing the same thing, running down, creating paths, but it's a little bit cooler, and it's more of the blue. I'm also allowing this to be a little bit chalky, seeing the different texture show through. Because it is a mountain, it's a little bit harder, right? You can get a little bit of that rocky texture. There we are. looking very three-dimensional now. So again, we started with the dark color, then we added on some middle colors, middle tones in the pinks and the blues, and now we're just adding on the highlights to really make everything pop the way we want it to. And on the warmer side, on the pink sides, I'm using predominantly more of a pure white, and then on the other sides we're using a mixture of the white and the blue just to ensure that it's still a little bit cool and pushed back in the painting. We can also throw some of these in to the ones in the background, make them a little bit more dynamic as well. Not much, they can be a little bit more impressionistic as they are far away. Generally, in paintings, the farther away things get, the more impressionistic they look. They're just kind of implications of whatever the subject is, whereas in the foreground, everything needs to be much more concrete and tidy. There we are. It's good. Lots of snow running up and down the mountains. Going to clean my brush fairly well now. We're going to incorporate some mist or some blowing snow. I'm going to take the medium-sized round-headed brush, dip it in some water here, and I'm going to grab some titanium white, maybe get a little bit of blue in there. I'm going to go to the bottom of the mountain, and then in a circular motion, just going to blend this upwards a little bit. As you can see, it's very soft. Not too noticeable. We can go back and we can get a little bit more. There we are. You can move in small circles or big circles. You can move up the mountain farther in different areas if you want. We're just trying to create a nice transparent layer to invoke a little bit more depth as well. And as you get closer, we use a little bit more white. We want like a transition and a gradient from the more opaque here at the bottom to more transparent up at the top. Just like that. So I will clean my brush fairly thoroughly. And now we're going to work on a set of trees here that's a little bit farther away. So I'm going to begin with my smaller square-headed brush. And here we need to decide on what color we want our trees to be. Now naturally we know that trees are green, and we know that they'll be covered in snow, which is going to make them green and white. But when things are farther away, remember that they adopt the colors of the background, which means slight pinks, slight blues, and that sort of thing as well. So I think what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to begin with something close to a gray. It'll be cohesive with that. We don't want it to overtake anything in the foreground, and when you place a color next to gray, it really pops out and it looks so much more stand out. So we're going to make these trees fairly subdued initially. We might even work in a lot of blue in them instead of green because of the reflective cool color and lights. So this is my initial color, and I might change it dramatically, but you are going to watch through the process. Then you can make your decision about what you want to do with it. So here I'm working on my trees. I can still see the drawing of them from before. Using the smaller square-headed brush again because it's very fine and detailed. It's doing a good job. But I'm quickly learning that isn't really the pigment I want. So I'm going to add a little bit more blue and a little bit more black to it. I'm using the pinky finger to support my hand on a relatively dry area of the canvas. And then I'm proceeding. There we are. When you work in really detailed areas, generally, I hold my breath. And I do that so that I'm a little bit more steady. Now, it's not very conducive to creating lessons, but if I go quiet for a minute here and there, it's just because I'm really concentrating and trying to get the best strokes I possibly can. Now, these trees right now are simply little lines, but we will definitely embellish them and give them actual limbs. We're just building up the foundations like we did before with the mountain. Start with something very simple and then we build. So right now, for these trees, we're using a real mixture of primary blue, or rather French ultramarine blue, Mars black, and a little bit of titanium white as well. There we are. I'm not being too careful around my trees because I will be able to see through them, and even if I can't with this darker pigment, that's just fine because I do have the initial sketch and I can always just redraw it. So it's really no worries. As you can see, I'm continuously going back and remixing more pigment. And I know that might seem a little bit tedious, but it makes you so much better at mixing color. We could have just mixed a massive amount of this pigment initially and worked from that. But because we're having to continuously go back and remix it, we're getting so much better at mixing that specific color and understanding how paint mixes and works. So if you find that you kind of struggle with color, mix small amounts of each color at each point in time. That way you have to go back, you have to remix it, and then you get just exponentially better at the process because you're doing it so much more frequently than what you would have had to do otherwise. And you're doing a lot of color matching. And color matching is really what's going to make you great at the process itself. Here we're moving down into the mountain. I'm going to get some really beautiful effects with these trees. It's very small trees in the distance. Rather, they look small because of perspective. They're the same size as these ones, but right up against the mist. There's a lot of gray in this painting, but it'll just make the colors of the house, of the trees in the foreground, of the reflected light, so much more noticeable. Sometimes, if you want to make something look really stand out, really beautiful, you need to put it next to something that's a little bit more washed out or mundane in color. And that's what we're doing here. We're giving everything in the foreground beautiful, beautiful place to really show off. As we get down towards the bottom of the trees, we can get a little bit darker in pigment if we want. The tops of the trees will be lighter as they'll be closer to the light and they will be absorbing and getting much more light. It'll be wrapping around them to a greater extent. There we are. So now we're done the initial layer of our first tree line, and it looks quite good, I think. Now what I'm going to do is you can do this with two things. You can do it with the small round-headed brush, or you can do it with the square-headed brush. If you do it with the square-headed brush, you're going to be using the corner. If you use the round-headed brush, you're going to be using all of it because it doesn't have a corner. I'm going to use this, but just know that you can use a liner brush or a smaller round-headed brush for it. I'm going to be taking that color that we were using, applying a very minimal amount of it to the corner, and I'm going to be tapping on little additions to some of these trees. Doesn't have to be a lot. And I'm trying to make sure that they're different on both sides, that I'm not rendering two trees the same way. Just like that. Creating something quite beautiful. I'm not doing it to all of the trees. Just the larger ones, the ones that are more prevalent, the ones that I think will be more notable in the foreground. There we are. As they get higher, you can kind of let the pigment get lost in the background. And as we get farther back here, the trees get smaller and smaller, so you don't need to do as much of it. It's much more subdued back here, and it's meant to be. You don't see the detail because it's farther away. Here, you can barely tell. But these ones in the foreground, they look quite nice. Now we're cleaning off our brush yet again. And we can add snow to these if we want. But what I would implore you to do is actually to wait to do these trees and everything else and see if it needs it, if it would look good with it. Sometimes it's not the best idea because you don't want to overcomplicate things. You need some areas to look less complicated so that the more complicated areas can look even better. So we're going to save that area there. And in the meantime, I'm going to switch back over to this brush. We're going to add in some additional mist, just like we did before. This time, I'm not going to use the blue. I'm going to take a pure titanium white, apply it to the bottom, and we'll blend upwards in a circular motion. There, I just covered up our building. It's a-okay. Remember, circular motions. Even build it up past here. If you find that it's a little bit too opaque, get a little bit more water, and then blend up from there. Just like that. Really pushing it in the distance here. Generally, when the value of something, how dark or bright it is very subdued, it's not very bright, it's not very dark, it's very much pushed away in the background. If you want your background to look very distant, that's a great way of doing it, especially when you have the same subject over in the foreground or middle ground and it's also very much pronounced. It has a very dark pigment or a very light pigment. So you can really do a lot just like that. Now, let's continue on with the painting. But let's begin in this area here. This is where we're going to have our little house. This is where we're going to have some snow. And we're going to begin by using this brush. And I'm going to use this brush for a lot of the snow because I want it to look soft. We're just going to start by taking some pure titanium white and applying it right here. And I'm doing this not because I want pure titanium white here, but to show you that pure titanium white doesn't really make sense for snow. Now, why is that? It's because it doesn't really show depth. We don't have a gradation, we don't have a light to dark, we just have a single pigment. And that really isn't what we want. What we want is values and changes. So, instead, what I'm going to do, something very strange, bear with me. I'm going to take this large square-headed brush, I'm going to take some black, I'm going to cover all of the areas that I'm going to want there to be snow on. This is going to give us something to build on top of. We can also take some blue, just so it's a cool tone. We can add some nice warm highlights on top of it. But it needs to be very dark. So that's what we're doing right now. I'm not using much water because I want this to be thick, and I want to apply most of it with a single layer. Just like that. When we try to apply a white on top of this, it's not going to go on smoothly, or it's not going to go on as a pure white. You're going to see the black and the dark underneath it. And that's fantastic because it'll give us an opportunity to build up layers of white and build up depth in them. So here, I'll throw some blue there, I'll throw some blue here, wipe off my brush, grab some Mars Black, cover this area as well. This protruding piece will be rock. We'll do that with more of a burnt umber, so I'm not worried about that right now. Covering up a bit of the trees, not worried about that either. There we are. Now this is currently blending with the white. so it's not as dark, but that's fine. I'm going to want this background area to be a little bit brighter anyways, or at least a little more subdued. So that's a good start. Now I'm cleaning off my brush. Make sure you clean off your brushes in between each application, because you really don't want them to dry out and dry with paint on them, because then we can't really use them and it's really hard to fix. So, doing a good job here. Now what I'm going to do is begin working on the trees here while I let all of that dry. And to do that, I'm going to need some green. So, we're going to take some of our primary yellow here, apply that as so. Pick a brush that we want to use. Now, if we want to block in a large tree, this is probably the right brush. But we could also use this one for some detail work. It'll take a little bit longer, but we'll probably get more of what we want. So I'm actually going to pick this brush here. I'm going to make sure that it's wet. We're going to take some of this yellow, put it right here. I'm going to take a little bit of blue, just a little bit, because blue is a much stronger pigment than yellow. We're going to mix up a little bit of a green. Then we can try to apply it. It's not bad, but it's very bright. So, let's think about what we're going to do next. How do we fix this color? What I would highly advise is you're going to take that brush, you're going to take some additional yellow, we'll mix in some blue. We'll do a little bit more of a heavy blue this time, and as you can see, it's almost all consuming. So add in some extra green, and we'll see if we like it. This is definitely a darker green than what we had before. Generally, you don't actually have to add in black or white to brighten or darken something. You just need to use more of the color you're mixing with, or rather the other color. So, we were using a lot of yellow in the first one, now we're using a lot of blue. And it's definitely a lot more of a dark pigment. It's a little bit more of a cool pigment, which isn't a bad thing, considering the painting we're working in. So I like that, but it's very transparent, as you can see. So we are going to use a little bit of black, just a little bit because it's so strong. We're going to grab a little bit of white. They'll make a gray, very thick pigment. We'll grab a lot of yellow, and again we're back to something very bright, so then we'll darken it again, turn it into more of a green with our blue. Now we have something a little bit more of an olive color, and it's nice, but it's not as dark as I'd like. It's not as cool either. So we'll grab a little bit more of that French ultramarine blue. There we have something quite nice, and we can begin trying to apply it again. Now I'm going to leave this tree intact and we can come back to it, but I'm going to work on a different tree. That way we can look at them side by side and see which colors we like better, see if we kind of fixed the issue. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm not using much water because I want it to be fairly thick here, just to get an accurate representation of what it is. And as you can see, the colors are extremely close, but this one, it's much more thick in pigment than that one is. So we succeeded in that department for sure. Now I'm going to take a little bit more blue, going to mix that in here. Be a little bit darker. Going to go back over that first tree. Now as you can see, we don't see the canvas underneath anymore. We just have a nice thick application. We can do this with some of our other trees as well. And right now, the trees are very much void of detail, and even shape for the most part. They're still blending in to the background to a point. That's okay, we're just building up in layers as we've been doing through the rest of the painting. Again, don't get discouraged if it isn't exactly what you want initially. It does take time. Now we'll also move over to this tree. We'll need a good amount of paint for it. So we'll just mix up a little bit more. Say we want it to start up here. Come down like that. We'll have some pieces that leaf out. Now that we're getting to the larger trees, we need to incorporate some actual detail. Trying to make sure that it's changing with these trees. The tops can kind of leaf up a little bit. And then as you get towards the bottom, the branches get heavier and they begin to fall. But you can get this nice little bell-like shape around the middle too. So at the tops of the trees, the branches go up. In the middle of the trees, they go more sideways, and out of the bottom, they go down. Just like that. So we'll mix up a little bit more, as you can see. Darkening it, lightening it, adding thickness. All of the processes we went through before. Nice, thick layer. Of course, we'll go back in and add snow and all of the detail work. Can even take that pigment, move it over here if we want. We can also add highlighted layers to these as well. So we start with a bit of a darker layer and then we build. There's also a tree right there that I almost forgot about. If we forgot, it wouldn't be the worst thing, because then we'd just have to go back and remix more paint, and it would make us a better painter. Make that one go to here. Working loosely around the house. Little cabin there. A nice little tree. Now I'm going to wait to work on this one once all of those are finished. So now we need to let those dry before we add in the lighter layers to them. In the meantime though, let's go back and let's rework on this area a little bit, okay? So I'm going to take the smaller round-headed brush because we want to work on some detail, but we want to work with snow, so we need it to be soft. So I'm grabbing this, I'm going to grab some titanium white. I'm going to start in the middle. Work it from side to side, and then up to create that mist, that blowing snow, whatever it may be. We can incorporate it over here too. Try to avoid the trees if they're still wet, as it will make this very green. Then I'm going to take some of that white, I'm going to add it over the black. And as you can see, it's not a pure white, we can see through it. It's because we have that black there, and that's how we're going to add dimension. So I'm using a bit of a tapping effect. I'm allowing some of the snow to be more transparent. We're building up to the back there. It all looks like a wash of gray, but gray that moves up and down, that has a proper gradient, as you can see. So it looks really nice and distant, while still preserving mounds that are higher and smaller. Here I'm going back in and adding in additional layers, leaving little openings of darker areas, making it look like snow is higher in some areas and lower in others. There we are. We can also go back in and add our house and all of that. But while we're here, might as well just play with it a little bit. See how much white you like to incorporate. See how bright you want it to be. If you don't like it, you can always paint over it with black and try again. So you never really are in danger of losing anything here. Now, I'm going to switch over to my square-headed brush. We're going to throw a little log cabin in the back. So I'm going to grab some burnt umber. Just like that. We'll move it down here. Grab a little bit of Mars black, a little bit of titanium white, more burnt umber. Throw in nice little log cabin. See how perfect the edges this brush is getting? They're so sharp. Have like a little side piece here too. There we are. Nice and subtle. Now we'll add in a roof. We'll make it black to begin with, and then we'll add some snow to it. We will add snow to this as well, and a bit of a mist and a fog. So we'll push it back a little bit in the painting, because it's not meant to be the main subject or the main foreground. I'm also going to get a little bit of a darker burnt umber and use that for the side. Make it look a little bit more three-dimensional. Make it in two parts there. Yeah. That looks nice. Now I also want to add windows in it so we can do some light and it'll reflect down here. But before I do that, I do want to let that dry. So much like the trees and everything else, the snow, it's about doing things in due time. While we wait for the trees to dry, the cabin to dry, and all of this to dry, as well as the snow, let's go in and work on this area right here. So I'm going to switch over to my medium-sized square-headed brush, because it can hold a good amount of paint and we can work around these sharp areas quite easily. And this can be water, this can be ice, it can be whatever really you want it to be. It can be ice covered with snow, and I think we want something very calm. So I'm going to grab some French Ultramarine blue, just going to throw that on there. And I'm thinking we do a blue down here, and then more of a pink here, then more into white and gray here. So it's kind of like a reflection, but it's a little bit surreal because it's not an exact reflection, but it's more of a reflection of the colors and the gradation in the sky. So we're starting with some French Ultramarine blue. Just like that. Bring it to about that middle point. Then I'm softening it. Very loose brush strokes. Can go over the black, no worries. We'll grab a little bit of white, tiny bit of black, just to desaturate it a little bit and to thicken the pigment. Then we'll grab some primary red, some titanium white. We'll add that right here. We can always go back and redo those darker black areas really easily, so don't worry about that. It's a nice pink. Now we'll blend the two together. We'll go back and forth, we'll use a bit of an X pattern. There we go. Get something nice and subtle. If you want, you can make it much more prominent, but I do want to have the lights from these reflecting in there. And if we make those too vibrant, the lights will be lost in them. So it's a little bit darker than the sky. It's a little bit more subdued in color palette, but it'll really help the light coming from that little building in the back there. So it's a sacrifice worth making, I think. Now we didn't go all the way to the edge, so we will do that. Make it a little bit more white heavy. There we are. Just wrapping it around. We'll do some soft blends. Again, maybe it's water, maybe it's ice. I'm not concerned. Looks nice. If you want it to be water, you can add some little waves running around. If you want it to be ice, you can cover it with some snow. Subdue it a little bit. but I think that's just right for what we're looking to do right now. Then, using that same brush, I'll just fix up the snow we covered up. Nice and easy. No loss. But that does mean we will have to wait a little bit longer there to work on our snow. With that said, the trees should be dry by now. So we can get some of our yellow, some of our white, just like that. Some green, a little bit of blue. As long as it's brighter than this. And we can go in, we can start tapping on some highlights. Just subtly. Just areas that'll be receiving light. There we are. I'm letting it be a little bit soft because these trees they're still not too close in the foreground. You might need a little bit of extra white to thicken it up because we are working on a darker back pigment. There we are. When they're smaller in the back, I'm a little bit less concerned about the actual detail. And as we get one like this, I'm a little bit more careful. Here I'm doing a bit of a dabbing motion, trying to get the idea that some of these pieces are flaring upwards. And then as we get down to the bottom, remember, the branches get heavier. You get more of that bell-like shape. You can do that over here too. More tapping at the top, moving the branches upwards. Then we move into that bell shape. Just like that. Nice and easy. And we can continue to build should we want to. But you don't want anything too bright, otherwise it'll take away from the snow that we add to them fairly soon. That's about as bright as I should get. There we are. Cleaning my brush yet again. Now I'm going to work on this area right here. Just the rock that's protruding. Taking some burnt umber, some Mars black, good amount of titanium white. We'll add on a simple base layer, and then we'll interject some depth with highlights and shadows, just as we've done before. There we are. Not a bad job. It's a subdued color for the most part because we don't want it jumping out too much. Now I'll grab a little bit of black, find some areas that I think will make good shadows, areas that won't be receiving as much light. We can darken those up. There we are. It's good. Clean that off. Make some highlights. Get the brown, the titanium white. You can even throw in a little bit of pink in there too, because that color will be reflecting around. We'll just add this to the sides that will be receiving the most light. Doing a lot of it in a bit of a tapping motion, because I want it to be a little bit more rough. We are working on rocks here. There we are. Not too complicated, not too simple. We have some highlights and we have some dark areas. Now, I'm going to switch back over to the medium-sized round-headed brush. I'm going to grab some titanium white, which is getting a little bit more difficult in here, as it's getting a little bit messy. If you find that it's getting too messy, don't worry, just pour a little bit more paint, and all should be well. Now, I'm going to apply some snow. So, starting here at the top, closer to the house, and then I'll, in round motions, work my way down. As you can see, it gets more and more transparent. We now have something that looks like mounds of snow. Amazing how that works. It's so simple once you have that black base to work on top of, or that blackish blue base rather, because we did have a lot of blue in there. Kept it nice and cool. Looks nice and fluffy because we're using the round motion. We're keeping some areas looking a little bit higher than others. All is well. There we are. Not perfect, but we need that to dry before we continue. So we'll move over here. We are going to cover up portions of the tree. That's going to be okay. We can go back. Now we have the start to all of our snow. We will definitely brighten it up. It definitely needs to be brighter than this back area, but it's a good first layer. Now I'm going to take the smaller round-headed brush, dip it in some water, get some of that titanium white paint, and begin applying that to the tops of our trees. Doing a lot of a dabbing motion, as you can see. But it's also worth noting that at this point, our water, it's no longer white. So whenever we dip a color like white into there, it's no longer going to be white. It's going to be diluted. So this is your friendly reminder to change your water. Otherwise, your white won't look like white. So I'm going to take a little break here. I'm going to clean that. I'm going to come back with some fresh water. Then we're going to jump back in to the snow. So I will see you in just a second. So we are back. We have clean water, and we're going to apply some additional clean titanium white paint to our palette. This way, we ensure we get exactly what we want. So now I'm going to dip this in here. We'll go back to our trees. And now we get that pure white that we really wanted. I'm only adding it to the ends of the branches because the tops of them will be covered by other branches, and the snow won't be able to rest in those areas. Showing the openings will also really help instill some depth in the painting. There we are. It's a nice first little tree. Now we'll go back over to this one. Really concentrating here, trying to make sure I don't overdo it in any of those areas. Starting at the top, moving out, occasionally moving into the tree. Have a couple of trees right here. Even if you don't have one in the area, like there isn't one right here, you can kind of just sketch it in. It'll make sense. It'll look like it makes sense anyway. It'll look just like the tree's a little bit darker. There we go. Beautiful little trees. Get lots of practice with them, applying our pigments here. Got a little bit of red on my brush by accident, so we're going to clean that off really well. We're not going to work around it. We're going to make sure that it is nice and clean. There we go. Doing a lot of that tapping effect on the larger trees because it'll look a lot more textured. As you can see, it's a lot more real rather than a brush stroke. It also blends less, which makes it less transparent, so the white really stands out when you do that tapping motion instead. Show you over here with a little bit more paint. Remember, the branches at the tops go up for the most part. The ones at the bottom leaf down. There we are. Looking quite good. Bring it down to the snow. And now we can actually go back to the snow. So, going to switch over to the round-headed brush. Going to grab some of that white. Going to go back up to that top area where I'd like there more attention to be. And we'll just move downwards. Same way that we did before. Round motions. You can do it with a lot less water as well. It'll be much more thick. You might get a little bit more of a tacky, chalky look, but it really won't be the worst thing with snow. The round-headed brush is innately giving it a bit of a feathered aesthetic, so it's a little bit softer. So you can play around with that a little bit more if you want. There we are. I'm allowing this corner to be a little bit darker because I want the edges to be a little bit darker in the whole painting. That way the eye isn't drawn away in any specific direction. Here we'll take some additional snow and we'll throw it back on here too. There we are. We also wanted to soften this a little bit, so we'll do that now. We can use our finger, and just like that, it's lost in the distance. Really beautiful. Going to switch over to the smaller round-headed brush. Going to grab some of our primary yellow. Going to grab some of our primary red. We'll need to use a lot more yellow than red because the red's a much stronger pigment, but we're going to render a bit of an orange. I'm going to take some titanium white, thicken it, then we're going to throw in a couple little windows here. And then we can add some light down here in the snow, make it really soft, And then we can throw it down here as well. Working back and forth with a lot of it. And it dissipates as it moves downwards. Not too noticeable, but nice, beautiful, and subtle in the background. Now, I want to work on this tree right here. So we're going to switch over to our medium-sized square-headed brush. Make that nice and wet. Create some green similar to that. So we'll mix it right next to our initial application. And we're doing that because we have a reference point now of what we want it to look like. There we are. Looking really quite good. Now it's quite subdued because we used a good amount of black and white, so we got a very thick application. But we lost some saturation. We can throw that back in if we want by doing another layer of more yellow and more blue. And I think we'll do just that. Painting is very much consistently problem solving. You try something, it either works or it doesn't, and if it doesn't, we ask ourselves why, we assess, and then we work on it yet again. So, I have some more yellow here, put that there, get some more blue. I'm mixing outside of the initial mixture, this way we just have those two pigments. You can see it's much more vibrant. And now I apply this. It's going to blend with the picture, or with the previously applied pigments. So it's going to be subdued slightly, but as you can see, significantly better. Much more in line with what we were looking for. There we go. I also want to throw some trees in the back there, so I'm going to take that subdued pigment that we had. Just throw those in. There we are. They will need snow on them, so we'll grab a little bit of that. And it'll blend with them at this point, but that's okay. We want it to be fairly subtle and a little bit more impressionistic. You can also add a little bit of a darker pigment. Give them a little bit of depth. And then throw more snow on them once it's dried. And that, I really think, will give us the best effect possible. Now, what I'm going to do is let this tree dry, let that dry. We'll then add the snow to all of it. We'll let that dry, and then we'll work on this right here. We'll add some light reflecting, and we'll really make the piece come together. So I will see you in a couple of seconds while we wait for this to dry. Welcome back. Now, look at what's currently in front of us, and I want you to ask yourself, what is wrong with this picture? We waited for that to dry, we waited for that to dry. They are now dry. We can continue. But can we? We're about to use snow. Snow is white, and our water is yet again green. So, we need to clean that before we continue. So I'm going to do that, and I will be right back yet again. And there we have it, a station finally ready to get back into painting. So I'm going to begin here with my titanium white paint, my smaller round-headed brush, and we're going to begin tapping on some of this snow. trying to make a lot of it at the top leaf upwards, and not just on the edges, because there are going to be protruding pieces in the middle, and that should be done more with a tapping effect. Just like that. Try to add a lot of inconsistencies. You don't want it to all look the same. And when you begin to run out of paint, remember, just grab more. You don't have to let it all dissipate. Here, we'll get into more of the body of the tree. There we are. And we'll have to build up some of these highlights as well, because we are working a lighter pigment over a bit of a darker pigment. Will be semi-transparent. Starting to look quite nice though. Little winter wonderland. Nice, calm winter scene. I'm quiet during this because I'm focusing quite a bit. Holding my breath so that I get the strokes I want. Covering a lot of this one with snow, and that is a-okay. There we are. We can even take a little bit of this, throw it back over here, as a lot of it's been subdued. There we are. So I like that a lot. I'm going to take a little bit more white, throw it over here, use our finger, blend it around, soften it up. Looks much better. Now, if this is ice, we can throw a little bit of snow on the bottom here as well. Makes it a little bit more three-dimensional. See that? You can move it out a little bit. It gets smaller and smaller as you move towards the background. There we go. Now, that looks very bright though, in comparison to the rest of the snow that we have in the foreground. So we have to brighten that up as well. It's not hard to do though. See? Just take a little bit more white. We just continue that layering process. Building it back up into the land area. Now you notice how that is much more bright than that, and that's exactly what we wanted from the start. So that is what I would call a good success. Now let's begin working on the house. And I'm going to begin here on this front area. Now, you might want it to be a stone house, you might want it to be a log cabin house. It's entirely up to you. I think in this rendition, I'm going to go with a log cabin. And for that, I'm going to need some burnt umber. So we'll apply that where we did before. This will match nicely with the brown we used there and there as well. So we'll grab that, some titanium white, some Mars black. Get something nice and mid-tone-ish. I'm going to go over all of the windows. It's a little bit dark, but that'll actually work all right. I'm moving all of the strokes horizontally. Then I'll actually take a little bit more of it. And we'll move this as well. There we are. Now what we're going to do, we'll grab some burnt umber, some titanium white, mix up a brighter variant of it. We'll apply this to the front now. Just build on top. Doesn't need to be perfect. Just trying to make the front a little bit darker here than the back. Going to grab some more of that pigment. Reapply the back, just because it was a little bit thin in the initial application. So generally work a little bit better if you let the layers dry entirely, but I don't think we need to right here. So that looks good. I'm very happy with that as our beginning point. Now I'm going to take this smaller square-headed brush here, I'm going to dip it in some water, I'm going to get some burnt umber, I'm going to get some titanium white, make a very bright mixture this time. Okay? And we're going to get into some detail work. So we're going to need to rest our hand very softly on an area. I'm going to draw a line across and another one, creating the logs that comprise our log cabin. Now because the pigment is still wet in the initial layer, it's going to blend to a point. It's going to make this a lot more subtle, which I actually really like. There we are. Continuously going back, getting more water and more paint, because it'll help us get much more fine lines, and the paint will glide across the canvas rather than being chalky and sticky. So there we are. If it doesn't stand out enough, we can always go back and add in additional layers. We need to do the same to the side here. Now the side is really dark and it's still quite wet, so it's a little bit more tricky, but still doable. We just needed to go in with a slightly brighter color than what we used here, but because it's on the dark, it's going to look darker. Again, the pigments on your palette here aren't necessarily what you're going to see on the canvas. Now I actually did decide that I want to make that a little bit brighter, a little bit more standout. So we have a nice bright pigment here. We can go back over those areas yet again. Nice little log cabin. I'm also going to take a little bit of that. I'm going to use the corner of my brush, create the ends of some of these logs, just with little circles like that. Nice and easy. You can do that on the other side as well. It'll just like snows resting on them. Doing them in little moon shapes. Just like that. Then I'm going to clean off my brush. I'm going to get a nice little gray pigment going on. Going to fill in the chimney. Needs to be a lot darker, otherwise it'll blend in too much with the snow. It's also something to note, if you're working from realism or a picture, and you have like a white stone of some kind, and it's in a snowy scene, probably best to take an artistic liberty and change the pigment at least a little bit, That way it doesn't blend in too much. This was kind of a little piece from my imagination, but that does happen a lot when working from actual reference photos. We're working around the tree here, which can be a little bit difficult, but we'll make it work. There we go. Now we'll grab some titanium white. And work on some highlighted areas. The front area. And then the top. We can go back in and add some actual stones to that, but it's a good start for sure. Now, I'm going to take the larger square-headed brush while all of that dries and work on the roof. And the roof could be a couple of colors. It could be more of like a nice red, it could be a nice blue color, it could be a burnt umber, it could be a black, but realistically I'm going to cover the majority of it with snow. So I'm actually just going to take a pure black, going to apply that. Going to get a little bit of water just to make sure that I get the nice sharp lines on the edges that I want. And we'll add snow here in the same way that we did on the ground. There we are. Looking nice and good. Very clean. So that is a great start to what we were doing. Now, I'm going to test to see if this is wet. Apparently not. I'm going to grab the smaller square-headed brush. I'm going to grab some of our titanium white, some of our primary yellow, tiny bit of our red. Get that orange. Create a couple of windows. You can make the windows very similar sized by looking at the line work in the logs, using them as reference points. There we are. Just like that. Might need to do a couple of layers just to ensure that the pigment is thick enough. Then we can make it a little bit wet and add some of that highlight down into the snow here. There we are. Nice and bright around the cabin. It would also look good if we did a little bit of a wash of an orange, which we probably do as we move through this painting. But now I'm going to get some of that Mars black. I'm going to work on some windows. Just doing a tapping motion, keeping it very concise. Balancing my hand with my pinky finger. Also going to do around the edges. There we are. I'm making that window a little bit less interesting, purposefully, because it's on the side of the house and I want the attention on the front of the house. So that is a good start right there. Now I want a door and I want it to stand out. So we're going to use a nice red. As you can see, the red pigment is not thick enough. So we're going to need to add some white Grab a little bit of black, grab some more red. This will be a little bit desaturated, but as you can see with this application, it actually covers the paint. There we are. If you don't like the red, you can switch it very easily. I think it's quite nice for now. We definitely need to do more layers with it, but it's a good start. But what I'm actually looking at here, and it's kind of bothering me, it's this tree right here. There's a little bit too much snow, and I want to show you that you can work reductively with it. So here I'm grabbing some yellow, some blue, just working that in, covering up a little bit of the snow that we had. Nice and easy. You can even use a little bit of black to darken it. Just like that. And now we can go back in and add snow however we'd like. But easy little fix. There we are. It's time we can add some more red. Just gets more prominent every time. And the roof should be done, so we can take our brush, and as you can tell, the water, it's not clean. Should probably clean that sooner rather than later. But here, as you can see, still able to do the roof. Cleaner water the better, but you can't switch it every time you use a new paint. I mean, maybe you can. Maybe you have a little bit longer than I do. And if you do, I highly respect that, and I hope you have a lot of fun. Working in a couple of icicles. Just like that. There we are. Need to throw some of that snow on our chimney. We're running up the house too. We can also throw some snow on the tops of the windowsills. Makes it look so much more natural, doesn't it? We'll also add a little bit of a smoke coming from here as well. Make it very transparent. We'll use some water, then we'll use our finger to soften it. Our house is very close to being completed. However, I think I've decided that I actually don't like the red door. So I'm going to take some burnt umber. Just a pure burnt umber. I'm going to try to cover it, see what we can do. Maybe take some titanium white, thicken it. The red's still a little bit too wet to work with, but that's okay. We will let that dry, and then we'll come right back into the painting. But in the meantime, I'm going to actually clean my water because that's a good thing to do. See you in just a second. We are now back, and I have my round-headed brush here. I'm going to grab a little bit of red, I'm going to grab a little bit of yellow, make a nice orange pigment, a little bit of titanium white to desaturate it, thicken it up a little bit. I'm going to make it very wet, very watery. A little bit of additional red. And now we have what's called a wash. It's a very thin layer of paint that won't disrupt any of the initial line work on the canvas. It's just going to add pigment and hue. So I'm going to throw this around the house where the light's emanating from. I liked the yellow, but I wanted it to be a little bit warmer. Then I'm going to use my finger to just move it around subtly. Just like that. We can also add it around the windows themselves. Make it a little bit warmer. Put it on the trees and things that are kind of around it. Make it look a lot more real. Just like that. Nice and easy. Then, I can take my square-headed brush, grab more of that burnt umber, fix the door. There we are. Add a dark side to the door. It's now a mixture of red and brown. I think I really like the combination. I didn't like the pure red, but I like what we have right now. We also need a little door knob as well. There we go. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our smaller round-headed brush, going to add a good amount of paint to it, just like that. A lot of water. Going to fling on some snow, as we generally do, to these nice little paintings. It's an easy way to render a lot of snow very quickly, saves so much time, and you generally get implications that are a lot smaller than what you could have made with your brush. Though, if you wanted to, you could definitely just tap your brush on the canvas a couple 100 times. We'll definitely do it a couple here. The one issue with the flinging is that sometimes you can get directional pieces. You don't always want that. It's a great technique for stars, it can be a great technique for snow, but generally the best technique is a combination of both the flinging motion and this very specific, very intentional application as well. Remember that the snow doesn't just fall in the sky, also falls on the ground, in the midtones, everywhere. And snow will be a lot larger in the foreground, so you get large pieces like that. But then there are also all of the small pieces that are falling farther away. So it's good to have a real size difference, as you can see. I also wanted to throw a little bit of extra snow on this tree. So we'll do that right now. The more snow you add, the more complicated the painting will look. That isn't a good thing or a bad thing. It's all about what you want. If you want a minimalistic look, or if you want more of a complex, very full look. I generally like the fuller looks, but that's just me. You're more than welcome to change the painting however you'd like and make it your own. I think I'm going to do a little bit more of that flinging motion. Be careful, it can be a little bit messy, so only do it if you're okay with getting paint on the surrounding areas. Could put down a cloth like I did here. Generally a good idea. The snow will really pop and stand out in the darker areas, predominantly. There we go. Now it's starting to look the way I want it to. Took a couple of applications though. Looking like a real winter wonderland at this point. And there we have it. That is essentially our hour-long painting. So, I truly hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. I feel like you now have the ability to go out and create this, or at least something similar. Hopefully it inspires something in you and you can enjoy. Remember, you can always go back, you can re-watch this, and you can continue to learn from it step by step. So thank you so much for spending this time here with me today. I can't wait to see you again, and as always, stay creative.